Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. After 54 years of brutal rule in Syria, the al-Assad family's reign came to an end in just 11 days last week. Armed group HTS made a lightning advance through Syria, entering Damascus on 8 December and taking control of the major cities of Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. Bashar al-Assad subsequently fled to Russia, where Putin granted him and his family asylum. After 13 years of devastating civil war, which saw over 1 million refugees flee to Europe and millions more internally displaced within Syria, there is both a sense of relief and celebration and a sense of trepidation and anxiety about what might come next for Syria. The fall of al-Assad, for a long time supported by his backers Iran and Russia, also has geopolitical implications and demonstrates how just reliant the regime had become on military and economic support from those backers. To help us make sense of these events of the last few weeks and what we might expect in the months to come, we're very happy to have with us Asli Aydintasbas and Nathalie Tocci. Welcome to you both. And Asla, I always try so hard with your last name, and I hope I try.
It was my first name. We'll do for now.
Okay. Well, just very quickly.
Nice try.
A for effort, maybe. Maybe A minus. I don't know.
B plus.
Yeah. Okay. Asla is a visiting fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, and Nathalie Tocci is the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali.
You did very well there, Andrea.
I know. After a long day of dialogue, you guys are putting me to the test. Okay. Asla, maybe let's start with you. And for our listeners, really just to lay down the most basic facts of your interpretation, your telling of what transpired over the last week or so, and where we are at the present moment.
Andrea, this has been a very interesting convergence of the two wars that we've been watching over this past year. The war in Lebanon, Israel's war on Hezbollah and Iran targets in Lebanon, and the war in Ukraine, leading to both the weakening of both Russia and Iran, which the opposition forces in a lightning offensive were able to capitalize on. It wasn't, of course, just the opposition groups that were in the north of the country. I think that if it were not for a green light from Turkey, none of this would have happened. Many of these groups have survived in the north of the country in a province called Idlib, in areas on the Turkish border. Initially, no one expected this level of success. This was essentially a coordinated military operation by some groups, including HTS, leading the charge, spearheading the operation, and their goals were to take the countryside of northern Aleppo. But very quickly, they found themselves Aleppo, the next day in Hama, and then Homs for the axis from north to south going down, and finally in Damascus. HTS is a group that had been controlling an area on the Turkish border where 3 million Syrians live, many of them refugees from other parts of Syria. The group has jihadist roots, which presents its own dilemma for Western countries and Turkey, of course. It's a designated terrorist entity run by a very charismatic leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. But the truth is, it's also been hugely pragmatic, and not just recently in terms of its messaging on tolerance and that they're not going to touch Syria's diversity, that Christians are free to exercise their religion, and they're not going to pursue a retribution campaign. But also during the 5 years they've run Idlib. So there is no denying that its leader and many of the fighters in the group come from jihadist roots. But there's also no denying the fact that they are now the primary power in Damascus. After a deal, which I think Turkey played a large role in, a deal that brokered by Turkey, whereby Russians have dropped their support for the regime at the 11th hour, throwing Assad under the bus and retreating to their two bases in Syria, which for now they're going to hold on to. But I say for now, I don't see Russians being able to keep a military presence in that country forever, even in the short term.
Can you talk to us? Well, maybe Nathalie, anything you want to add to that, go ahead. I'm really curious to hear from both of you. Nathalie, if you want to talk about how you think this news, these developments have been received and understood, not just in Italy, but maybe from different quarters across Europe. And then also really curious to hear how this is being talked about in Turkey as well.
Okay, so perhaps on what has happened and then how the European reactions to this have been so far. I think this is really one of these situations where in retrospect, you look at it and you think, well, yeah, I mean, that sounds pretty obvious, right? I mean, if you think of the last year, how incredibly quiet Bashar al-Assad was, right? I mean, this was basically, despite everything that was happening in Gaza, then in Lebanon, then, directly between Israel and Iran, essentially Damascus was zip quiet, right? And that in and of itself, again, in retrospect, it was very clearly a signal of progressive weakness. I think what we also knew, and we've known for a while, is the way in which Turkey, and I'm sure Asli can then talk more about this, but Turkey was increasingly frustrated by the fact that despite having actually tried to engage Assad in a negotiation, and despite the fact that it was under everyone's eyes that Assad had been weakened significantly, the intransigence from Damascus remained absolutely unchanged. So we have a weakened Assad, we have a frustrated Turkey, we have then, and this has been talked about at length, a weakened Iran and a distracted Russia. You kind of put all of this together and it's kind of a no-brainer. Now, the point is it was a no-brainer that no one thought about, right? And this is really the point that I wanted to emphasize. And it really has to do, I think, with the nature of dictatorships. We never really know what happens inside. We never know what happens in the black box. And that makes them intrinsically difficult to predict. We can point at all of the features of unsustainability, but we will simply never be able to know when it cracks.
And I always say they're stable until they're not.
Exactly. And I think, sort of whereas exactly, sort of democracies have all these kind of ripples on the surface, and that's where all the focus is. In the case of a dictatorship, you just simply don't see the tsunami coming, right? And so that, I think, should give us reason to pause, not just as far as Syria is concerned, but other countries. From the Russias to the Irans itself, to the North Koreas of this world. Now, by this, and simply to kind of highlight the fact that I don't therefore mean that we should be planning on, returning back to the old dreams of regime changes, because, we kind of know how that went, right? But simply that we should be very humble in recognizing the fact that by definition, we simply cannot be very good at understanding dictatorships and what happens within them. The second thing that I wanted to say is, and as obviously a consequence of this being a dictatorship and an incredibly bloody one, that we can only rejoice, right? The fact that Assad fell can only and unambiguously be a good thing. Now, that doesn't obviously automatically mean that the future is rosy, and there are, of course, several reasons that give cause for potential concern, and they range from essentially the risk of shifting from the dictatorship of a minority to the dictatorship of a majority. So that's, I think, one set of issues, and of course, everything that goes towards the direction of inclusivity and rights protection mitigates, in a sense, that risk. And then I think the other big risk really has to do with the fact that at the end of the day, Syria is still not a united country, right? So there is still large swaths of the territory which are ungoverned. And we know what tends to happen in ungoverned spaces, right? Pretty nasty things tend to sprout from ungoverned spaces. And obviously here I'm mainly thinking about terrorism. So now the fact that there are those two risks out there does not mean that this should, as I said, mitigate our judgment on what has happened as being an unambiguous good. It should, however, make us reflect about what kind of levers we can use, and here is where I come to what we Europeans, we the West, we Turkey in the case of Asli, should be thinking about in order to ensure that those risks are mitigated. And incentives are put in place to ensure that Syria moves in one direction rather than another. Now, the levers that Europeans can play essentially boil down, and I'm sure we can come back to this later on in the conversation, but they boil down to reconstruction. What is, though, so troubling about the European reaction so far is that we've heard very, very little about, hey, how can we play a role in Syria by playing a role in its reconstruction? Most of what we've heard is really symptomatic of Europe's non-role, because most of what we've heard is, oh, well, now, Syrian refugees can return home, which the fact that you start suspending asylum applications less than 24 hours after a regime has fallen is, let's set aside the morality of it, because frankly speaking, there's no moral actor in this game. The Iranians, the Russians, the Turks, the Israelis, the US itself, forget the morals, right? But simply the actorness about it. It really speaks to a Europe that is not thinking about this region, is not thinking about this country, is not thinking about its role of what ultimately is, a neighboring country. So that is, I think, what has been most unsettling to me about this so far.
Yeah, and then you pile on the tweet from incoming President Trump. I was just looking it up to make sure I got the wording right. The United States, all in caps, mind you. United States should have nothing to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved. Now, Asli, tell us then the Turkish perspective. Is it, different? So we heard, Europe so far, other than shutting off applications for visas and other things less than 24 hours, not a lot going on. Trump saying US should steer clear. How is it being perceived or what are the reactions in Istanbul and Ankara, I should say?
Well, so Europeans had come to accept the fact that Assad is there to stay, and there was almost a better the devil that sense, not just in Europe, but elsewhere, particularly also with Gulf Arab states that had been trying to normalize relations. Assad offered a certain predictability, very oppressive and bloody, but its escalation with Israel was really there was a rhythm to it that was very familiar to everybody. It was a weak state and many wanted it, but now he's gone. I think Turkey is clearly, if Iran and Russia are the sore losers, Turkey is clearly the winner. They stood firm behind the opposition, initially for regime change, but later on to protect opposition-held territories and recently supporting this offensive. And, they are feeling very triumphant. I think Erdogan and people around him are feeling like they have just, conquered a new country in a sense. Ibrahim Kalin, Erdogan's intelligence chief, was in Damascus, the first any leader to go to Damascus of any sort of country, and met with Jolani, the leader of HTS. This was a victory lap. I think Turks may come to regret their support for HTS at some point in the future, but right now I think they are feeling very giddy. Having said that, I think they do understand that HTS comes with a baggage. It's a designated terrorist organization. It is, sending all the right signals, but has jihadists on its ranks. And that we should not move from a dictatorship of the minority to a dictatorship of the majority, because you can rule Idlib, the northern province that Jolani and HTS has been running, as a Taliban a version of Taliban light, but you cannot do that in Damascus. Syria is a very sophisticated country. It has a very it has a tapestry of it has a diverse country with a human tapestry of ethnicities and faith that are really represent the spirit of the Levant. And I think that Turks understand that HTS cannot solely run Damascus. They will push them for a power sharing agreement and an inclusive form of transition until we have a new order, whether it's elections or something else. So I do think we'll see a Turkish push for that. But the bigger question is what Europe's role is. And that is all about whether or not there will be a rethink in relations with Turkey, not just for Europeans, but also for Americans. The secret is the secret that everybody knows is the relations have been basically in almost a coma. There has been no contact with Erdogan policy, minimal contact, I should say, on a need-to basis. Turkey's relations with the US have been up and down. Very much a desire to keep Erdogan's Turkey at arm's distance because of all the issues we know about human rights, democratic backsliding, human rights issue, Turkey's assertive regional policy, and so on and so forth. But now there is an ascendant Turkey as a dominant player in Syria. And I think that requires a rethink in European policy on Turkey for a number of reasons. You actually do want to help Turkey be successful in this hand-holding of jihadists in Damascus. You actually do want a stable Syria. And I think Turks have more than they can chew at this moment. Because the project was never about a big transition in Damascus. It was just controlling northern Aleppo countryside. So I do think that this is a moment in which we need a closer relationship and coordination between Turkey and Europe and Turkey and the United States. I know this is one of Jim's favorite topics, but I just think the moment calls for that.
Jim, did you want to get in there or no?
Sorry about that. Hey, guys, thank you so much. That is just excellent. And I do want to jump on that last point about U.S.-Turkish relations, because this it's not just U.S.-Turkey bilateral, but it ripples into NATO and other issues that involve Europe. And so my concern is not just the relationship, but what's happening on the border right now. That's the basis of the problems that we've had with Turkey over the past 10 years, of course, is the northern Kurds in Syria and the various militias backed by Turkey, backed by the U.S., that have begun shooting at each other too. And my question is, do you think that now is an opportunity for the U.S. and Turkey to try to bring to an end that friction in terms of the Kurds? And I mean, it's going to take a long time. It's very nuanced. It involves, so many larger issues. But do you think we have an opening to at least begin to bring to an end that friction and come up with something that makes sense, that protects Turkey and Turkish concerns, as well as for the United States? It doesn't leave our particular militia, left out hanging, without the U.S. there. So, any hope along those lines?
To add to Jim's question, I'm going to mix this up. So is there though not a risk exactly that essentially Trump will wash his hands and not really care about the Kurds? And so actually there could be quite a convergence between a Turkey that doesn't want to compromise on the Kurds and the US that doesn't care about them anymore. I mean, is that a risk, Asli?
Gosh, that's my fear.
That is, but it's not necessarily destiny. Look, there are two
Right.
warning signs, I think, right now in Syria, other than Damascus and the possibility of far more conservative Taliban light type of a regime whereby Jolani gets too drunk on power and doesn't want to go for a power sharing agreement. So that's a worry about Damascus. That's the other two worrying signs for me are one, Turkish Kurdish escalation. And secondly, Turkish Israeli escalation.
Absolutely.
Increasingly, Turkey and Israel are seeing Syria as the theater of their rivalry, and their rivalry is now almost verging on hostility. Turkey is thinking that Israel is bent on preventing Turkey's rise and is trying to make trouble for Turkey. And Israelis are increasingly sending out sort of signals about a new renewed relationship with Kurds and US-backed Kurdish groups, even talking about independent Kurdistan, etc., which just serves as a trigger for Turkey. I do worry about that. There are 900 US troops in eastern Syria that were initially there in the anti-ISIL campaign. They're
Come on, come
embedded
on.
with the Kurdish forces called SDF. Obviously, during his first term, Donald Trump wanted to pull them out, decided not to. He was actually convinced by bureaucracy that it wasn't a good idea for all types of reasons, including curbing Iran's regional ambitions. But there's a different reality now, and he could walk into the White House on January 20th and say, you know what, those 900 guys, which he remembers, and it was very clear from his tweets that he hasn't forgotten this issue, pull them out because we don't need to curb Iran and Syria anymore. But there is, and this would, of course, create lay the groundwork for greater Turkish Kurdish escalation or fighting between Turkey backed Sunni Arab groups and Kurds, or the current rulers in Damascus, the new rulers of Damascus and Kurds, because they too will want to reduce the Kurdish autonomy. Kurds are likely going to Kurds should need a place in the future of Syria. There's no doubt about it. And they will probably likely have to settle for a smaller area, their autonomy than what they have now. But who does that negotiation? I mean, I think US is best positioned continue the course for a little longer and engage in diplomacy to bring that about, to wash your hands clean and say we've got nothing to do with Syria, and leave the scene with a government of questionable ideological background in Damascus for Turkey, leave it all to for Turkey to handle, and possibly laying the ground for sort of renewed Kurdish escalation would be a bad idea. I think everyone has to switch gears and sort of get into the space of diplomacy and transition and a stable pluralist Syria, even Jolani and HTS. I mean, now they have to be politicians and thinking of a new constitution, thinking of elections down the road at some point. Turkey as well. But, until then, and until Trump administration comes in, I think we're also going to see some sort of a scramble between Turkey-backed groups and Kurds for more territory, for land grab. I will say there is one positive, perhaps silver, sort of perhaps one little light at the end of the tunnel, which outside of all of this, in October, and Nathalie, you probably know about this because you've recently been to Turkey, Turkish government started talking about a new Kurdish opening, a reconciliation process, something whereby they started talking about resuming contacts with imprisoned Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan. Of course, the Kurdish issue inside Turkey and inside Syria, is intertwined. We're talking about the same Turkey on both sides of the border and same groups, essentially, same movement on both sides of the border. So I think that US diplomacy and Western diplomacy has to be now very focused on encouraging Turkey to take the reconciliation route and actually also push Kurdish groups for more flexibility, ideological flexibility, and for diplomacy, because uh, it would be a mistake also for Kurds to solely rely on U.S. troop presence and the tweet every now and then that comes from Israeli foreign minister and talks about Kurdistan in Syria. Those may be sort of misleading options for Kurds. In the end, their future really is safer and more stable and more secure if there is a treaty and a deal and a reconciliation with Turkey. That would really enormously help Syrian Kurds as well.
Let me perhaps add to this a reflection. If you think of, on the one hand, Jolani's and HTS's role in Syria, and on the other hand, you think of Turkey's role in Syria, you could almost make an argument which basically says, well, in both cases, so both at the domestic level in the case of HTS and at the broader regional level in the case of Turkey, you kind of have to be magnanimous in victory, right? I mean, it's in the long-term interest to be magnanimous in victory. And when it comes to the internal Syrian situation, being magnanimous in victory essentially means setting up an inclusive process and system. And normally, players are not instinctively magnanimous, and they need a little bit of nudging, right? And in the case of HTS, it's Turkey that can do the nudging, right? I mean, supported by the United States, supported by other European countries, but it's Turkey that does the nudging, right? In the case of Turkey and Syria, and in particular Turkey, Syria, and the Kurds, it's Turkey itself that has to be magnanimous in victory, right? And so the question is, who are the players that can induce Turkey to be magnanimous in victory? And this is where the earlier point that Asli was making, I think, comes in, right? Which has to do both with the US-Turkey relationship, which Jim talked about, but also the EU-Turkey relationship. And in a sense, the change that has happened in Syria opens up a possibility that has two sides to the coin, right? So on the one hand, what we know is that since essentially 2016, the EU-Turkey relationship was largely dominated by one issue. That one issue was migration and the migration statement, and the transactionalization of the EU-Turkey relationship really boiled down to migration. And hey, what was the whole migration story all about? Well, it was about Syria, right? So in a sense, what the change in Syria opens up as a possibility is that there's going to be a deflation of that particular dossier as a consequence of change in Syria, which opens up the possibility to turn the page on the EU-Turkey relationship, because you can actually build a relationship which does not simply boil down to that transactional logic, but boils down to a wider logic, which is, and this is, I totally agree with the first point that Asli was making. At the end of the day, now, in this situation, the goals that Turkey has and other European countries have, and the United States has, presumably are kind of more or less the same, right? In terms of the kind of Syria that we would like to see. Turkey has clearly a political advantage. European countries can bring to bear an economic advantage, passing through reconstruction, right? And so clearly there's an argument to be made there about bringing these things together.
I agree, Nathalie, but I will point out that I was following Ursula von der Leyen on Twitter. I mean, it's been a week of the offense since the offensive started. She tweeted that she's had a conversation on Syria with the King of Jordan, King Abdullah. Next day, she called UAE MBZ, Crown Sheikh, and the next day and I was thinking, when are you
going to actually make that phone call?
Turkey, like, do you think it makes sense? By the way, somewhat relevant in this context. So, I mean, there is an institutional difficulty in dealing with
totally.
Erdogan. Understandable, but we need, I think the moment calls for a more nimble and flexible position.
One question can I throw in? Because it seems some of this discussion, and Nathalie, you're talking about the deflation of the migration file as dominating that relationship. But the question is, are we really out of the woods? And I'd have to go back. We've done so much work on how autocrats exit really shapes the trajectory. And I think if you look at when governments come to power through an insurgency like this, the prospects for a pluralistic, highly functioning democracy, or democracy would be a stretch, but even like a highly functioning government, I think are still low.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, are we out of the woods, or what, when you look at the trajectory or what's likely to happen, what are the prospects that this descends into more of a failed state status, that the opposition forces can't unite and come together, and that we see a renewed period of instability inside Syria?
Well, I mean, I would say, and Asli knows much more than I do about this, but I would say, if left untouched, I would almost guarantee it to go in the wrong direction, right? I mean, all the premises are there for it to go in the wrong direction. And it may well be that we all kind of bend over backwards and it will still go in the wrong direction. However, I think there is a possibility that it won't. And so I think the conversation to be had is, how can everyone that has an interest in an inclusive, more or less democratic Syria to actually come about? And so I think the conversation should also revolve around, okay, so we know that at the moment there are sanctions. We know that there is a reconstruction piece. We know that there is a political relationship, particularly between Turkey and now Damascus, right? So we know that there are all of these different pieces, right? We know that there is still a US military presence in Syria. So how can all these pieces be linked to one another, right, in a strategy? What is the timing that we should think of? So I find it a little bit weird to sort of think, well, you just kind of lift sanctions overnight, bang, right? I mean, surely this is something that should be done progressively, conditionally, right? But I think the point is we need to figure out a plan, right? At the moment, as I said, it's almost as if, particularly if I think of Europeans, we're kind of confirming the worst stereotypes. We're not even thinking about all this. I mean, A, that phone call is not being made, and B, we're just thinking about suspending asylum, rather than thinking about, who are the players that have a stake and a role and an influence, and how can the different instruments be pooled, in a sense, right, to serve a common strategy.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, we haven't got to the Iran and Russia piece except kind of tangentially, and we can get to that in a second. But as most analysts out there are highlighting, it was really the degradation of Russia and Iran that, created a conducive environment for HTS to take over. But the flip side is, and so it was Russia's distraction, you would say, that created this. To what extent is Europe too distracted and focused and engaged on Ukraine to have the bandwidth, attention span, and energy to do all the things that you just talked about?
I mean,
can they do both things?
Well, yes, because in a sense, what we're talking about is two very different things. So firstly, I would say that in Syria, at the very best, Europe is, kind of actor number 3, right? And firstly. Secondly, we're not talking about a military role there, right? So we're talking about diplomacy and we're talking about reconstruction. This is kind of, this is the kind of thing that is easy for Europeans, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that they kind of know how to do. They're in their comfort zone. So it doesn't actually require the setting up of new instruments, the setting up of, the development of different capacities. So, and as I said, it's at best a tertiary role in this game. So I think that it's doable. I think it's a mindset that Europeans at the moment seem to be lacking, and by the way, not just in Syria, which is, as I said, so troubling.
I'll keep continuing with my negative questions. But if Europe doesn't step up to play that role, if an incoming Trump administration is true to the tweet and doesn't want to have anything to do with Syria and doesn't want to get involved, what are the prospects, and maybe this is a slightly uninformed question, but what are the prospects that Russia and Iran could recover some of the ground that they've lost? So we know for Russia's perspective that they're going to be reaching out to other groups and actors inside Syria, given the importance of maintaining their bases and their presence there. I guess the question is this like an irreversible loss for Russia in particular? Or if there is a vacuum, can you imagine Moscow and the Kremlin being able to recover and regain its footing?
I do think it's an irreversible loss for both Russia and Iran, because they banked on a brutal regime which fought a war against its people. And now people are back in power. And if they hate the Assad regime first, they hate Russia and Iran second. So I think it would be very hard also sociologically speaking for them to have a foothold in a new Syria where the Sunni power will be on the rise. Their power rested on the Alawite minority. And while it's never a good idea to write off Iran in the region, I think in this particular instance, I find it very hard. They will pay for their sins.
I agree. I mean, I think it's the role that they once had. I think that is, that loss is irreversible. I mean, look, they will not desist from trying, right? And, there's a certain pragmatism amongst regimes in the Middle East. So, I think we shouldn't dismiss the fact that they may somehow establish a relationship, but that relationship will not be comparable to the one that they had.
Jim, did you want to jump in?
Yes, if I could just for a second. What's interesting is if, in fact, we see Russia having a total pullout from Syria, where do you think they would go to maintain their foothold in at least the maritime side of the Mediterranean? They've had their historic maritime ties with Libya, with Egypt. Where do you think they would go? They've got 2 submarines that's not going to be able to go back to the Black Sea Fleet. I don't know where they're going to go, but I mean, do you think they go back to Libya? Where do you think their next home would be?
I think Libya would be my best guess. It won't necessarily be easy, right? Because, it's not as if, the situation in Libya is not what it was in Syria, right? In Syria, there had been a clear victor until the victor lost, right, to the civil war. Whereas Libya is still totally divided. But I think that's, at the moment, they don't have great options, and that's the best of a bad lot.
Also, right. Jim, I want to say they've made a calculated decision to pull out at the 11th hour because, they saw Assad losing, but also they did not want to jeopardize their economic relationship with Turkey because that is almost their lifeline. And the Turk Stream pipeline across the Black Sea is their only outlet starting in January. It's going to be their only energy outlet to Europe. Their only way of supplying natural gas to European countries in the southern Europe corridor. So they have done some sort of a strategic calculation and decided to keep the economic relationship. They're not happy about it, but they're still not gone from the Black Sea region, of course. Yet let's not forget that there too in the Black Sea, they had to, half their fleet is decimated. They had to go towards the east of the Black Sea region. In the Caucasus, they have experienced some setbacks, both in Armenia and Azerbaijan. So it's not looking really too good for Vladimir Putin, except on the Ukrainian front, where he's doing quite well.
Yeah.
Right.
At a high cost for Russian people, of course.
Exactly.
And Ukrainians.
As a final question to both of you, and I mean, understanding fully the fluidity of the situation and how volatile things remain, I guess if you were getting out your crystal ball and looking over the next, 3 to 6 months, how do you expect things to play out in Syria? Or at least what will you be watching?
Asli, maybe you go first.
Well, I'll be watching the evolution of HTS and the relationship between HTS and Turkey. There might come a point in which that relationship is more strained than what we see now, because HTS might try to hold on to power or refuse calls for a power sharing. I think it's very important for Western actors, Europeans, Americans, to come into the play, and for Turkey, for them to present a united front with Turkey, putting the pressure, including the Gulf Arab states. I think there will be many countries that want the project in Syria to fail, including in the Middle East, including maybe some of the Gulf regimes that don't like popular upheavals and representative politics and so on and so forth. We all have an interest in Syria actually turning into some type of a success story, at least a stable story. So I do hope it doesn't fail. I kind of think it's more important than ever to see Turkish-European, Turkish-US reset, if for nothing, to provide a de-escalatory path on the Kurdish issue and prevent continued fighting. I think we don't know what the future of Syria will be. As Nathalie has said, there is a good scenario, and there's also a sort of state collapse, internal division, continued fighting scenario. But we all have an interest in making it work. And if left untouched, it's sure to fail.
Nathalie, I want to add, I meant to ask you this because I'm curious your thoughts on the Iran nuclear piece, actually.
Yeah, I'll add that.
Yeah, because there's been obviously lots of people talking about the more Iran is down, and it was already down because it couldn't really impose meaningful costs on Israel. Its proxies are being degraded, and now you have this on top. How concerned are you that this accelerates incentives inside Iran to go nuclear?
Okay, so I would say, as far as Syria is concerned, what I would watch out for is, firstly, does the country re-become, because it wasn't, right, united in territorial terms, right? I mean, does the country, does it come gradually under the same state institutions, right? So does the country hold together or come back? Does Humpty Dumpty come back together? Second, and related, what happens to state institutions, right? As Asli was saying, do they hold? Do they implode? But what happens to state institutions? Thirdly, obviously, the process, right? I mean, the political process and how inclusive that is, and where do elections feature along the line? Fourth, what happens on the sanctions / then reconstruction side? And then finally, on your Iran question, I really think this can go in two very different directions. I think, as you were hinting at, it is clear that an Iran that has seen two of its three pillars of deterrence having been weakened very significantly, actually has a big incentive to accelerate on the third, and that is the nuclear program. And if you look at and listen to what Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA, said just a few weeks ago, there's been a quadrupling, right, of over 60% enriched uranium. So this is not looking good, right? Now, on the one hand, that's not looking good. On the other hand, there is Trump coming in, and there is a risk of an escalation there. However, what are the mitigating kind of factors? Firstly, in a sense, whereas when Trump came in first time round, in a sense, there was something there to destroy, right? There was the JCPOA to destroy. Now there's nothing left to destroy. So, in a sense, a hawkishness on Iran can only manifest itself by an outright war, as in supporting Israel in an outright war. And I thought Trump was I'm the no forever wars kind of guy, right? So there may actually be an incentive in the US to look for a diplomatic way out. And there may be an incentive in Iran itself, right? Precisely because of that weakening. Now, I don't think that is the most likely scenario. I think that we're more likely to be on an escalation scenario. But a little bit like the conversation that we were having on Syria, we've got some levers there. And how is it that we can use them? And I think that on this, actually more than on Syria, Europeans actually do have a role. And I would say, Europeans in, probably China in, Russia out, and Saudi in to this in this conversation. What is it that we can do to actually bring about a negotiation on the Iranian nuclear file?
Just another crystal ball question, if I can. What are you looking for now as you gaze into that crystal ball for the U.S.-Turkey relationship? Based on what's happening, what could happen, what should happen, based on Trump coming in, what are you looking for in terms of the next 100 days or next year? What are you guys looking for in terms of U.S.-Turkey relations?
I think definitely the type of Trump Erdogan chemistry in how they approach, how much willingness they show to deal with some of the more thorny issues in the bilateral relationship. We still have to deal with what happens to S-400s. Are they going to have a sort of a meeting of the minds in terms of how they approach Ukraine-Russia issue and war termination and whatnot? That is number one, the Trump Erdogan dynamic. I think we are entering a very personalized state of diplomacy, clearly, and both men love it. So the ripple effects of that. But when it comes to Syria, I think U.S. has two options. Three options. You could just say, I'm packing up and leaving Syria. It can reduce its troop numbers, but dedicate itself to some sort of a peacemaking role between Turkey and Kurds. Or thirdly, it can say, you know what, I am not staying in order to to protect these troops, the Kurdish forces, against Turkey. So that would obviously create continued escalation with Turkey. I mean, the tenor of it, how this policy is formulated, what kind of a map what kind of a geographic reach is we're talking about, all of these details matter a lot. I hope Trump administration is thinking about these things. I see different people tweeting. I don't think they had to have a Syrian policy until this moment. Now they need to.
Nathalie, did you want to add?
Yeah, I would just very briefly add that probably alongside everything Asli has said, the one thing that I would be looking for is what is Trump's ask, right? So if there is a more positive dynamic between him and Erdogan, if presumably he will care less about the Kurds and maybe give more leeway to Turkey than what Democrat administration would have given. So if basically kind of Turkey gains from this, what is Trump going to ask in return?
Whew, that was a lot. That was really excellent. I mean, there's just so much in flux. I mean, obviously, it's been such a for Syrians themselves, and it's just such a big change. And it's very hard to anticipate which way it goes. But then also geopolitically, and so really, again, the reminder of when you have these personalist autocrats, Nathalie, I guess to bring us back where we started, just how quickly things can change. It really is remarkable. And I think you both have offered such useful perspectives, but also recommendations for how the situation can be managed, navigated in order to raise the prospects of some of the more promising scenarios that you both outlined. So I really, really appreciate it. I thought it was such a rich conversation.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.